Hello, my name is Mallory Jenna Robinson. Join me on A Hateful Homicide, a true crime podcast dedicated to telling the stories regarding the murders of transgender, gender non-binary, and gender diverse community members in the United States and abroad. This is A Hateful Homicide.
911, what's your emergency?
Yeah.
A transgender woman has been shot and killed in North Baltimore. Alpha.
In the U.S., trans women of color have a life expectancy of just 35 years.
This happens on a daily. Another one of my friends got killed right up the street from here.
These cases are true. The victims are real, and their voices matter. This is A Hateful Homicide. The murder of Brandon James Teena. Friday, December 31st, 1993. Humboldt, Nebraska. Warning: the following episode you're about to listen to will contain evidence of misgendering. Listening discretion is advised.
19 years ago left emotional scars on the people of Humboldt, Nebraska.
3 people killed, including Brandon Teena, a 21-year-old transgender Nebraskan who the convicted murderer now sits on death row for.
In this exclusive special report, 1011's Chad Silver speaks with a man now facing execution.
Most everyone who lived in Nebraska in 1993 remembers hearing about the murders. John Lauder at the center of it all, accused of shooting and killing Brandon Teena, Lisa Lambert, and Philip Devine. The court ruled Lauder and Marvin Neeson raped and killed Brandon after learning he was actually a she. The other 2 just happened to be there at the time. Lauder has maintained his innocence. For his plea deal, Neeson was sentenced to life in prison, Lauder to death row. And that's where he's been for the past 16 years, waiting for his final punishment, but hoping for an appeal. Do you think that he will be executed?
Well, there was a time I'd say no, but I don't know. That's one thing. I don't sit there and say no to that possibility. Now with the way things have went, especially here of late, it's clearly getting more and more that it could be a possibility.
The appeals aren't going his way. First denied by the Federal Court of Appeals, and then the U.S. Supreme Court in March. As he sits here at the Tecumseh State Correctional Institution, he knows his time is almost up. What is it like knowing that, every day you go by and it's possible that you could get a call tomorrow and it's someone from the state and they said, okay, this is the day that you're going to be executed?
Well, I don't look at it in that terms. I just look at it, I got a appeal that I got in front of the court, and I know that could go one way or the other, and then I know after I get to a certain stage, there's that possibility that a date could be set, but I know that ain't etched in stone.
Are you ready to die?
Unless there's, of course, some kind of mental defect in them. Everybody has a will to live, everybody's gonna fight, with every breath they have to live. So I don't have that mental defect, so of course I'm gonna, fight for, every last breath that I have to, prove my innocence and get out of here.
Lauder's push to prove his innocence faces a hurdle that he might not be able to cross. During their trials, Neeson testified that Lauder was the one who pulled the trigger. Then, 12 years later, he changed his story and said he murdered the 3. But because of a 3-year statute of limitations passed by the state legislature, Neeson's admission isn't allowed in an appeal without DNA evidence.
The way they had it set up, DNA, the way they tore it down by the time it got passed was that DNA would be essentially the gateway. And once you had DNA, then you could put all the evidence that supported that DNA.
Do you think that you will be exonerated?
I think if I was there at the hearing, if I was to have a full-fledged hearing where I could put on the evidence I think I can prove my innocence. I really do.
But the statute has been on the books since the early 1900s, and there's no sign it'll change anytime soon. Reporting in Tecumseh, Chad Silver, 1011 News.
It's Friday, December 31st, 1993. 21-year-old white trans male Brandon James Teena wakes up to a hail of gunshot bullets. The doors kicked in. Brandon, who had been on the run from two individuals, 21-year-old cisgendered male Marvin Thomas Neeson and 22-year-old John Paul Lauder, both white cisgendered men. The three men, Brandon, John, and Tom, had been having issues with each other. The three had initially began as friends, starting back in the spring of 1993, when Brandon, a native of Lincoln, Nebraska, had relocated to the city or town of Humboldt, Nebraska, after getting into some trouble. Well, John and Tom, who were both notorious for being bad boys, quickly took in the newly arrived Brandon to the city of Humboldt. And while in the city of Humboldt, Brandon meets an 18-year-old cisgendered female by the name of Lana Tisdale. Lana is the subject of quite a bit of the story because she was the love interest of Brandon. She was his girlfriend. They were together for quite a while before his hateful homicide on December 31st. Again, welcome my audience. Thank you so much for tuning in today to this episode, season 2, episode 5, Dead Before Dawn. And as we go through this case, it's, we're going to talk a little bit about who Brandon was and his identity and how that really began such a visibility in the early 90s for our trans masculine individuals. As we know from season 1, we covered several trans masculine, trans male cases that were more in the 2010 decade. And so this case here takes us back a little bit further, almost 30 years ago, and it's very heartbreaking, but it was a very widely garnered case for the time that it happened. It had such an intrigue of being from the heartland, the Midwest. Then, of course, you had these, this element of gender identity and sexuality and violence, and then the victims, because unfortunately, Brandon was not the only victim of this hateful homicide at the time on December 31st in 1993 at 11:30 p.m. Brandon, who was in the home with his good friend, 20-year-old cisgendered female Lisa Lambert, and her partner, 21-year-old African-American cisgendered male Philip Devine. And so Lisa did have an 8-month-old son, not with Philip Devine, but with someone else. And so she was a single mother who had welcomed Brandon into her home, because by this time, which we're going to go a little backwards in just a moment to give you a little bit more context into this case, but to kind of give you this idea of this buildup that led to that night, Brandon had fled from Falls City, Nebraska, where the main incident happened between him, John, and Tom. He then goes to Lisa Lambert's home, and her boyfriend, Philip Devine, was visiting for the Christmas holidays and New Year's. And so he was already in town visiting from Lincoln. So when Brandon went to Lisa's home on the night of December 30th, just a night before the hateful homicide, it was for safety. And Lisa took Brandon in. Lisa was also a good friend of Lana's as well, and Lana was the girlfriend of Brandon's. And again, we're going to get into this whole very complicated love story that ended so tragically with 3 people dead, and also at that time an 8-month-old little boy without his mother. So, this case just really pulls at the strings of so many different identities, whether you're a trans man, whether you're a single mother, whether you are the partner of a single mother, or the partner of a trans man. You're going to hear so many different testimonies. You've already heard a little bit from John Lauder 20 years later. So that audio was from 2013, where he's still on death row currently, but that was him, speaking in an interview about the probability of him going to being put to death. But we're also going to hear from Brandon, his own words from an incident that happened, which we're going to talk a little bit about in just a moment. And then also, again, you're going to hear some more audio from the actual, I don't want to say confessions, but interviews with John Lauder and Tom Neeson. And then finally, from the lady of this story, Lana Tisdale, Brandon Teena's girlfriend, and we're going to hear from her as well. So there's going to be a lot of conversations in here. So let's get into it. We're going to go back to April 30th of 1993. Brandon James Teena, born December 12th, 1972. He was born in the city of Lincoln, Nebraska, to a 16-year-old mother, Joanne Brandon, and a father, Patrick Brandon. Unfortunately, Patrick had died just a month into Joanne's pregnancy. And so Brandon never got to know his father. He was the youngest of two, so he has an older sister named Tammy. And so pretty much his childhood centered around him, his older sister Tammy, his mother Joanna, and his maternal grandparents, who he essentially grew up with while Joanna got herself together. Well, of course, the childhood was very traumatizing. Joanna did marry when Brandon was 4, and she divorced when Brandon was 8. So the only stepfather that Brandon had was out of his life by the time he was 8. And we do have court evidence records stating that Brandon and his sister was taken out of the home because of being sexually assaulted and molested by a male relative. And so again, you have this childhood context of Brandon's journey. And, even in his early youth, the late 70s, early 1980s, Brandon began to definitely express himself in a very masculine way. Having short hair, he was definitely into more at that time what would have been considered more masculine sports such as basketball, football, weightlifting. And then also him and his sister Tammy were placed into a religious private school, which definitely had a lot of connotation on sexuality and gender and what that looked like for individuals. And so that was a very challenging time for Brandon. And ultimately, during his sophomore year of high school, he left his home that he shared with his mother, Joanna at the time, and moved in with a girlfriend by the name of Tracy Bills. The two lived together for a while, but unfortunately, Brandon was a victim of intimate partner violence and returned home to live with his mother. By his senior year, Brandon was identifying as a man. He had become very vocal to his community as well as his family about his gender identity, and he did begin to date cisgendered females. He did initially go by the name of Billy Brinson, Brinson being a family name of his father's, and then he would also finally choose the name Brandon James Teena. He was described initially as a socially awkward teen, and then he became an outgoing class clown. Unfortunately, his mother, Joanna, was not supportive of his gender identity and social and medical transition. She refused to accept his male identity and continued to refer to Brandon, misgendering him, misnaming him, And this definitely had a strain on their relationship up until Brandon's death, and even unfortunately after the tragedy. As we know, in some of these cases, while we do have some families who are supportive, like my family, but then we have families who aren't, like Brandon's. And so Brandon unfortunately was not buried or laid to rest as Brandon James Teena. And so that was an act that his mother decided on. And so, and that's how he was ultimately buried. And so again, he did graduate class from high school in 1991. And but prior to that, he had been expelled. Again, he was described as the ideal man who was the perfect balance of rugged cowboy and athletic jock with a kind of Kennedy-like jawline. He had a handful of romances, but with the lack of support from loved ones. And he was also at times a little trepidatious about his gender identity. Brandon did face depression like a lot of us, and he did trigger warning attempt suicide in 1991 after being expelled from high school, though graduating but being expelled. And then of course he was placed in the Lancaster County Crisis Center for a few days, where he did receive treatment. Also, you know, it's important as we talk about this case, as we delve into the hateful homicide, as Brandon was murdered just before dawn of New Year's Eve on 1994. And it's important to also, again, go and talk about who Brandon was. Again, just before his 21st birthday, Brandon arrives in Homburg, Nebraska, where he wanted to begin a fresh start. He again picked up friendships with John Lauder, Tom Neeson. He began to date Lana Tisdale, but Brandon did forge checks and had been arrested prior to coming to Humboldt in April of 1993. And so he had, you know, during April up until about October of 1993, his relationship with John Lauder, Tom Neeson, and Lana Tisdale was going relatively well. There's photos in the blog that I posted through Transgrio Weekly that you can check out. Photos with Brandon and John, and Brandon and Tom, Brandon and Lana. So there was a really strong friendship there. They all, you know, were this kind of bad crew that got into trouble, did things, but it was like, you know, harmless, like young adult trouble in a small town of Humboldt. But again, around October of 1993, Brandon's past came back to haunt him. The checks that he had forged had ultimately led to him being arrested, and he was in the Humboldt town jail for a good month and a half. Finally, on December 19th, 1993, Lana Tisdale shows up to pay his bill. But she found out at that time that Brandon was housed in the cisgendered female section of the jail. And according to Lana, this was her first time aware of Brandon's gender identity. According to Lana, when she confronts Brandon on December 19th, 1993, just 12 days before the hateful homicide, Brandon states that he was intersex, and that he was placed in this cisgendered female section, and that he was seeking gender reassignment surgery. And so Lana was a little skeptical about this. She wasn't quite sure what to make of this, but nonetheless, she loved Brandon. The two had been together at that time for 7 months. So he was, and we're going to hear from her later as well in an interview. And you can hear the love that she had for him. And despite learning of his gender identity, she stood by Brandon. But she was also cognizant of the fact that John and Tom, who had also discovered this after Lana had discussed with her own mother, Linda, the recent developments of Brandon's gender identity. Linda then tells John Lauder and Tom Neeson, friends or supposed friends of Brandon's, about his gender identity. And then this would lead to a very tragic scene of events stemming just really within a short period of time. I mean, you go from December 1993, where that afternoon where Lana is bailing Brandon out of jail, discovering his gender identity, to then, confiding in her mother, who she's close with, who's Brandon is also close with, Lana's father, Leland. So the whole family is close with Brandon. She's disclosing to her family, as sort of a confidant situation. And then this, of course, trickles to John Lauder and Tom Neeson. And though Lana and her family were, understanding of Brandon's gender journey, John and Tom were not. And they reacted in such a rage and violence towards Brandon. And by December 31st, 1993, 3 people would end up dead, shot to death. Brandon, 6 gunshot wounds, the head, the torso, and the back. Lisa Lambert, twice in the back. And Philip Devine, once in the head. The only surviving member of that hateful homicide was Lisa Lambert's 8-month-old son, who shall remain anonymous. But before the hateful homicide on December 31st, 1993, we have to go to December 25th of 1993. It's Christmas Day, and Brandon is hanging out with Lana at her home when John Lauder and Tom Neeson arrive. They had heard these rumors, right, from Lana's mom, Linda, and Lana's dad, Leland. And they arrive to Lana's home that she shared with her parents, where Brandon was staying. He had been staying there since he had been released from jail after he had spent over a month for being arrested on forging checks back in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so he is at the home. They are celebrating a Christmas party. They come in and they immediately confront Brandon. They want to know, is he assigned female at birth? They take him to the bathroom of Lana's home, literally picking him up, placing him on the bathroom counter. They unbutton his pants, pull them down. Well, they discover Brandon's anatomy. They make him put back up his pants, snatch him out of the home, place him in the back of Lauder's car, and drive to an abandoned industrial building. There, they sexually assault Brandon, both of them, and then return him to the home of Lana's. Brandon was then rushed to the Falls City Hospital emergency room. Rape kit, sexual assault kit, from the frontal anatomy, as well as the anal and oral anatomies, were all tested. A police report was filed, and Brandon would then have to file an audio, account of this vicious assault placed upon him, which was his worst fear. It was his worst fear to be sexually assaulted again by a man. As we know from his childhood, he had already been sexually assaulted by a male relative, him and his older sister. And so then to now go through this at the age of 21, it was very heartbreaking for Brandon. And so he is then, interviewed by the Nebraska sheriff of Richardson County, Charles Law. And he asks these very inappropriate questions. In his mind, I guess he felt like he was being thorough and asking the questions that he needed to ask to get the information he needed to document. But again, I'm about to go ahead and give you all an idea of what that looked like. Again, warning, this interview, this interrogation is very traumatizing to Brandon. You're going to hear a little bit of that from Brandon's own words. So again, I do caution you to just definitely listen with caution. Thank you.
Your Honor, which way to stand? right here behind your one. How do you hold it? You took it. John under your pants, right? You pulled your pants down how far? Last reach. How far you pulled your underpants down? What'd you have in your underpants? Nothing in your underpants? You didn't have sock. You run around once in a while with a sock in your pants to make you look like a boy. Alright, so after you pulled your pants down, I assume you was a girl when you did it. Did he bother you in it? You didn't bother you in it, huh? Did that kind of amaze you? After you pulled your pants down, and wanted to take you to bed, and you told him no, that he was a boy, you couldn't do that? Did that kind of get your attention somehow that he would have put his hands in your pants and play with you a little bit? Huh? I can't believe that if he pulled your pants down and you're a female, he didn't stick his hand in your finger. I can't believe he did. So when I got ready to hold you, how was your position in the backseat? He's on your back. When these guys started in the first half. You tried saying if I die, you say you never had sex before, that's correct? And which one tried to do this first? Tom didn't get it in you? Huh? He said he didn't get you in. Well, I know that it's possible to tell them. First was Tom, that's right. Then Tom went out and went to then what happened? Then when John got back, what did he do? Alright. After you got your pants down, you got spread it too. Right? You spread out, you got to spread it you then. Then what happened? Let's back up there for a second. First of all, you didn't say anybody getting it out. Did he have a hard on when he got back there or what? He did look. Did he take all the time working it out or what? Did you work it out for him? No, I didn't. You didn't work it out for him? No. Did you think he had it worked up on his own or what? I don't know. You never had any sex before? No. How old are you? And if you're 21, you think you have something to do? Right. That was hard. Never get me to fix it. Why do you run around with girls instead of guys? Being you're a girl yourself. Why do you make girls think you're a guy? Nice idea. You go around kissing every girl? The ones, the girls that don't know about you think you're a guy. Do you kiss them? Because I'm trying to get some answers so I know exactly what's going on. Now, you want to answer that question for me or not? Huh? The only thing that goes before that answer, that question's going to come up in court. And I'm going to want an answer for it before it goes to court. You know what I'm saying? You what? Sexual opportunity. You want to explain that?
As you can hear, Brandon was traumatized. The sheriff of Richardson County at the time, Charles Locke, was very blunt. He was very brutal. He was very hateful in the way that he spoke to Brandon. You could definitely hear, though some of the the audio was a little ineligible, and apologies for that. But to give you again, for what you could make out of this interview, you could hear him just, asking these very, blunt and very, I feel like just disrespectful questions. And you could also hear Brandon, he said, what does this have to do with, what is me presenting male and me dating cis females? What does that have to do with me being sexually assaulted last night? And that's the key question, because everything that Sheriff Locke was asking was totally irrelevant to the ultimate goal, which was getting justice for Brandon. And so what he was doing was re-traumatizing Brandon, who had just went through that the night before. And so again, I just wanted to give you all a little bit of that context as well. But again, let's go stemming from here. So this interview happened on December 26th of 1993, again, at the Richardson County. This was in Falls City, Nebraska. So after Brandon does the interview, or he's interrogated by Sheriff Charles Locke, he then leaves Falls City, Nebraska, because he knows, based on what, after, this recording is done, that John and Tom are going to be arrested for sexual assault. That much is true because of the fact that when Brandon had went to the Falls City emergency room and they did that sexual assault kit, there was evidence of sexual assault, very violent trauma. And so again, all of that was very evident. And regardless of how Brandon identified, assault is assault, sexual assault is sexual assault. So John Lauder and Tom Neeson, both who already had criminal records for violence, were going to be arrested for that. So Lana and her family as well, because they felt bad for the fact that John and Tom had, especially Tom in particular, was very violent with Brandon. And so, they felt guilty and they felt bad. And so Lana reached out to Lisa, a good friend of hers, and Lisa, who, cared for Brandon. He was a likable guy, very charming. And despite this situation here of his gender identity, he was a likable guy. And so Lisa wanted to help Brandon. And so she thought, along with her boyfriend Philip, that it would be the safest and smartest idea for Brandon to come to Humboldt, Nebraska, which was just about 30 minutes north of Falls City. Brandon arrives on December 26th, and he's there. Around the same time that Brandon arrives to Humboldt, Sheriff Charles Locke and his team are arresting John Lauder and Marvin Thomas Neeson. They both are arrested and they are interrogated about the allegations that Brandon has accused them of, which is sexual assault and battery. And so the two deny it, and they are held in the Richardson County Jail without bail for a couple of days. Their families come up with the bail on the morning of December 31st, 1993. So that's that Friday. And they get out of the jail, and the two are fuming. My audience, they want to know, where is Brandon? Where the hell is Brandon? And they immediately go to Lana's home that she shares with Linda and Leland. It's a little dicey on if Lana, Leland, and Linda willingly told John and Tom where Brandon was, or if they were forced or coerced into disclosing where Brandon was. But nonetheless, the information is given to Tom and John. Tom Neeson, again, 22-year-old cisgender white male from Nebraska. Both him and John had no goals, no ambitions, and we're going to hear from them in just a moment. But and this is actually following the hateful homicide of Brandon, Lisa, and Philip. And so you're going to hear just, and this is very early on into the murders. And so you hear very, very bluntly how they feel about the whole situation. And even though in the beginning of the episode we could hear John, kind of making peace with his fate and seemed a little more calm 20 years later, in 1994 when he's arrested, and when you hear from him at this time, he was very much proud of what he did to Brandon and the others. And so they get to the home. It's around 11:30 p.m. Friday night, December 31st, 1993, in Humboldt, Nebraska. It's a winter night. There's snow. The Christmas lights are still hanging in Lisa's home. Her 8-month-old son, he's fast asleep, snuggled. Lisa and Philip have just went to bed before the New Year's morning. That countdown. They have about a 30-minute countdown. So they're like in their bed, watching some MTV. Brandon is in another room, a guest room. He's asleep. He's been on edge. He's actually been very fearful. He had actually spoken to Lana just, a day before. We're not sure if Lana was able to get the information to Brandon about John and Tom being on their way to commit the hateful homicides. But we do know that they spoke the night before, and Brandon was afraid. He was thinking of even just getting out of the state of Nebraska. And unfortunately, he did not get that chance. And so, again, around 11:30 p.m. on Friday, December 31st, 1993, the doors kicked into the home of Lisa Lambert. Brandon wakes up, believing his worst nightmare about to come true. John and Tom called out for Brandon. "Where are you?" Brandon comes to the front door of the guest room. He's pleading, "Hands up, don't shoot, please. I'm sorry, I'll recant my testimony." 6 gunshots go out, shotgun blast, killing Brandon. But that wasn't it. Tom Neeson grabs a butcher knife and stabs Brandon 6 additional times. Then, into their horror, Lisa is screaming, her 8-month-old son on the floor, crawling around blood. Philip, who is also pleading for their life, saying that they won't say anything, they won't identify who has just committed this hateful homicide. Both are shot. Lisa twice, once in the head, once in the back. Philip, once in the head. All 3 are now dead, laying on the ground. This 8-month-old little baby who is on the floor, crawling around, crying, screaming. He had been laying in the bed with his mother and his mother's boyfriend. He is left there for hours. It's not until dawn of 1994, Saturday, January 1st, 1994, when Lisa's family was unable to get a hold of her. She was supposed to attend a New Year's family event with her son, and they hadn't been able to get a hold of her or Philip. Philip, who was visiting from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, his mother also was wanting to wish him a happy new year and had been unable to. So she reaches out to Lisa's family. Lisa's family reaches out to Lisa. They don't get an answer. Lisa's parents drive over to the home that their daughter had with their 8-month-old grandson, and visualizes a carnage, a macabre scene like no other. Their daughter. They can't even believe that that's their daughter. Unrecognizable. Her boyfriend. This guy who they know as Brandon. All 3 of them are dead. Their 8-month-old grandson walking around in a soiled diaper. It was heartbreaking. It was traumatizing. Well, the Humboldt detectives want to know what is going on. They walk onto the scene. And they, talk to Lisa's family, and then they get this context of they believing that this hateful homicide stemmed from Brandon, the guest, who had already had this situation, who was fleeing from a violent situation in Falls City, Nebraska. The Humboldt, Nebraska team reaches out to the Falls City, Nebraska team. And as they do, they uncover, this December 25th, 1995 sexual assault of Brandon, and the fact that John Lauder and Tom Neeson have been released just a few hours earlier. And then they also speak to Lana Tisdale, and they uncovered that John and Tom had went to the home of Lana and her parents just a few hours before the hateful homicide, confronting them, threatening them to tell them what Brandon is, which they do. And so it's pretty clear at that time that John Lauder and Marvin Tom Neeson are the perpetrators of this hateful homicide. And they're ultimately arrested and brought in and interviewed. The 2 go to trial in 1996, and they ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder, and are sentenced to death, both of them. Now, the interesting thing about this case is that you ask yourself, well, did they get put on death row for Brandon's case? Not necessarily. Though, and at this time, we have to think about hate crimes and what that looked like. And the state of Nebraska had no hate crime laws, especially for individuals pertaining to gender identity. And so this case, this tragedy, it ultimately, the only reason why they were found guilty of first-degree murder was because of Lisa's case, because of the fact that she was a single mother, and because an 8-month-old boy was crawling around in a pool of 3 individuals' blood. That is where the first degree, that is where the death penalty comes in at for them. And that is, in a way, justice for Brandon, right? And for Philip, too, because we also have to look at Philip, who was a black cisgender male in this hateful homicide as well. And though both him and Lisa were casualties, unfortunately, you still have to pull into this idea of what does that mean for justice for him as a black man, and even for Lisa as a single white female, single mother, and even justice for her son. So, justice was served, and they are currently on death row, both Tom and John. But I do want to take you all back into, again, when they were initially arrested back in 1994, January of 1994, to give you all a context into their mindset and committing the hateful homicides of Brandon James Teena, Lisa Michelle Lambert, and Philip Todd Devine on December 31st, 1993.
Get better than jobs, a lot of them are on welfare and stuff, if you got somebody that gets a job and keeps a job, especially a girl that don't end up pregnant and end up on welfare for the rest of her life, you're pretty damn lucky. So that's Falls City for you. Oh, we went out drinking together. We talked about women. We ride around and say, well, what about that one? What about that one there, just guy talk. Yeah, she didn't like Brandon. She didn't. Neither did Linda. Neither did Melissa. only one did was my honey. She was just so really, I mean, she was really brainwashed. And I think even still today, she probably still half-ass brainwashed. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised she's still calling me he, and knowing damn well that she. Tom pulled down her pants and he put his finger up there and said, oh, you know, there's something, you know, there ain't nothing there. She's a girl, you know. And I said, well, I saw something. And I looked at Brandon and I said, what was it I saw? You know, just playing it off.
I mean, you guys can sit there and shake your fucking heads no, but I told both of you, well, not both of you, because I don't think I talked to you on the phone, but Susan, I told you on the phone there's going to be some things I cannot answer because they could endanger or whatever my appeal process.
He wasn't even on top of her yet, you know. He was doing something with getting something out of the coat and stuff, which I found out later was rubber, you know, and then, you know, a little bit later he was out of the car and he came to me, you know, and said, well, you know, I want to go back there and stuff like that, you know. And I went back, you know, stupid, and I went back, you know, but I didn't have sex with her, you know. I went back there and I tried, but I couldn't keep it up. Too drunk. Thinking of my fiance at the time too much. Couldn't get it up. I did ejaculate in the rubber because of the going up and down and the rubbing, you know, when I did get it up, trying to proceed to put it, you know, have sex with her. But every time to go down, and because of that, you know, I, you know, ejaculated. And I said, fuck it, and got up, you know. You know, she was very, very quiet. She didn't say nothing. She, you know, she said ouch a few times, you know. You know, that's it, you know.
I felt ashamed. I felt ashamed that someone would make alleged charges against me that I had participated in the rape.
Her biggest fear
Was
was to be touched by a man, to possibly be raped by a man, because she was a man.
Because I knew that if I took the polygraph, that they would know that Tom had went back there and had sex, and that I went back there and tried to have sex. You know, even though I knew that it was, as far as I knew, consensual, I knew that Keith Hayes, just being the person he is, no, he like, that's all I need, and I'd go back to prison because they wouldn't give a fuck what I said.
You know, both of them being in prison, both of them realizing they were going back, and rape carries 50 years, both of them being ex-felons, they were going to get some time out of that. And they figured, you know, just, you know, if we can shut her up, you know, if we can take care of the one that's pressing charges, we ain't going back. So that's exactly why they had to do that, you know, I can see that. Well, they were just alleged charges. So I wasn't real worried. They were just alleged charges.
They were just alleged charges. Those are the words from Tom Neeson. John Lauder as well, as you could hear the testimonies from both of them. As you could hear, this is back from 1994, March of 1994. And you could hear them being very brazen, very apathetic. There was never a mention of, you know, sadness for the 8-month-old boy who lost his mother, or Philip Devine's mother who lost a son, or Lisa's parents, or most importantly, Brandon's mom, Joanna, and his sister, Tammy. So, or even for Lana, right? And her family. So, you know, that is why they are on death row. That is why they are still on death row. And that is why they have been denied appeals every single time, because they still have not acknowledged the hurt and the pains that they have caused that entire community. The entire state of Nebraska was rocked by this hateful homicide of Brandon, Lisa, and Philip. And yeah, there's this, it was more so because they were worried about, going to prison for 50 years for sexual assault. But in reality, the sexual assault occurred because they were targeting Brandon for being trans. So they can, unpack it however they want to. The reality is that they targeted a trans man simply for being who he was, simply for the fact that he was more popular. Let's be very quite clear about that. Brandon was more attractive. He was more popular. He was more likable in a town that they were from. How dare he, according to them, probably with this anger that they had when they unleashed all of this on December 25th and December 31st, right? How dare he come into their town, take their women, and as you could even hear from John in the beginning, they felt like Lana was brainwashed, quote unquote, as if she couldn't think for herself and love Brandon and accept him without being, quote unquote, brainwashed. This is the ideology that they had. So the hateful homicide is that. It's that because of the fact that Brandon was a trans man and they wanted him gone. And how dare this man not only just not accept the sexual assault, because that's really what they wanted to do, was teach him a lesson and just have him sit in that. But when he spoke up and he was a self-advocate, and he even advocated against himself with the sheriff, as you heard in that testimony about what does this have to do, what does me dating cis women have to do with me being sexually assaulted, right? Brandon's always been a fighter. He fought for himself. He got out of his, abusive home, and he made a life for himself. And though he got caught up in some things, he still was like a lot of us as trans folks, looking for love and just wanting to get his life together and be the best version of himself. And unfortunately, that, like the lives of all of these 21-year-olds on the late evening going into the dawn of 1994, Friday, December 31st, 1993 in Humboldt, Nebraska, when Brandon James Teena, Philip Devine, and Lisa Michelle Lambert were all met with a hateful homicide. As we prepare to conclude this case, I want to, leave with the words of the woman at the center of this entire case, Lana Tisdale. Lana has since been married, and, she no longer lives in Nebraska. She still maintains a relationship with her mother and father. But, this case really did impact her, and she, still to this day blames herself for Brandon's murder, for Lisa's murder, right? Because she knew Lisa. She was a friend of Lisa's, and she knew Philip. And if she had not told John and Tom, right, her and her family had not disclosed that location, then maybe the outcome would have been different. We don't know. I do believe that at the end of the day, John and Tom were determined to murder Brandon. And that was what they were going to do. And they would have on December 25th. It's just so happened that they didn't. But they ultimately decided to, and it happened. And unfortunately, Lisa and Philip were, in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I do want to take a moment and just let you all hear how this impacted Lana and the love that she had for Brandon. And then we'll prepare to conclude.
He wasn't pushy at all. We rarely talked about sex. He wasn't one to just jump in bed with somebody. He said whenever I wanted to, whenever I was ready. Because he said he didn't care if it was months. He said it could be months after months. And there's a time up to me where they couldn't push me into anything. The guys around here, you go out for a week and they want you to have sex with them right then. He wasn't like that at all. He's not pushing you, whatever guys do that. So how did you feel when he said that? I thought that was really good. I was kind of relieved because I wasn't used to that. Most guys I know around here, that's about all they want. They really don't want a relationship. The band, they wanted a relationship. They wasn't just going to go out with me for sex. They went out with me because they really liked me. That Thursday was, the 28th or 29th of December. He was here one night. He wasn't supposed to be. We kind of snuck in the house one night. My mom was gone. So, I left. I went uptown to get some pop and cigarettes, and you wrote me while I was gone. And you're just sitting there writing, because you have nothing else to do. So, you wrote me a little letter. And read it down. I Alright, it says, "Dear Wendy, well, figured I'd write you. Hell, I can't think of anything else to do. I guess I'm lost, at least at a loss of words. First of all, I wanted to say I'm sorry for all the shit that has gone on. I know that saying I'm sorry is not enough, but that's all I can think of saying. You mean the world to me. Or at least the part I know. And I'll do anything you ask, just ask me, okay? Besides, I guess we both understand we're both crazy. Love, Brandon. The best letter I ever wrote." Just sitting there and wrote that to me. I thought it was very sweet. Okay, well, people around here saying that Brandon was crazy and he was dangerous. And everybody thought that he was messing with my mind. Thought that I was, I guess, out of it or something. Well, my parents wanted me to go to this place, I guess, up in Lincoln or Omaha. I don't know what it is. I call it a crazy home for crazy people. I don't know what it's called, but they wanted me to get help because they thought Brandon was really messing with my mind. So, and I told them about that, and so people were calling me and him both crazy. So that's why I wrote that part. So I'm not crazy. And neither was Brandon. He was not crazy. I mean, I wish he would have told me from the start, but he didn't. I wouldn't have made fun of him or walked away. I think he should have told me from the start, or told people from the start. I mean, he thought we were really going to be his friends. I mean, he should trust them and not to lie to them. I think people ought to tell people, not just go around acting like someone else they're not.
So you could hear that Lana really did care for Brandon. And of course, at the end, you could hear her opinions about disclosure. And of course, we as trans folks have to be very cognizant of how we disclose because of situations like this. And so, as we prepare to conclude, I just want to say to my brother, you have been a leader in so many ways for the trans masculine movement. You spoke up and stood up in the state of Nebraska, in the city of Lincoln, Falls City, and the town of Humboldt. Brandon James Teena, we remember you. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, forever, and always. Born December 12th, 1972, and resting on since December 31st, 1993. Again, thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode of A Hateful Homicide. My name is Mallory Jenna Robinson, your host. Please, you can listen to us on Anchor, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And then you can also follow us on Instagram at A Hateful Homicide. You can follow me at Mallory Jenna 90, MALLERYJENNA 90. Again, please use the hashtags A Hateful Homicide, Transgender Awareness, True Crime Podcasts, Suspenseful Saturdays. Again, thank you all so much for tuning in. Stay tuned for next Saturday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And as we prepare to go into Transgender Day of Remembrance, also known as TDOR, next Saturday. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.